Good morning, everybody, and thanks a lot for coming along to this IFS Green Budget event. So we're launching one of the chapters of the Green Budget today, a chapter focused on the labour market, timed today to coincide with the end of the furlough scheme, which is happening today. We're incredibly grateful to the Nuffield Foundation and to Citi, with whom we are producing the Green Budget this year once again. We're also very grateful to the Economic and Social Research Council, whose funding makes everything that IFS does possible. So what you're going to see today is one chapter from the forthcoming Green Budget, a couple of adverts for you. Next Thursday, we will be launching another of the chapters from that volume. That's looking at the challenges facing local government as it struggles with the ongoing impacts of the pandemic on its revenues and its spending. And then on Tuesday, the 12th of October, we have the main Green Budget launch, where we'll be focusing on the outlook for the economy, for the public finances, and the challenges for the Chancellor as he prepares for his forthcoming budget and spending review. But today's event is all about the labour market. It's about what happens now furlough is coming to an end. We've got two presentations for you. First of all, we're going to have Jonathan, who's going to present for about 15 minutes, focusing entirely on the analysis that's in the Green Budget chapter that we're releasing today. He'll then hand over to Xiao Wei, who's also going to speak for about 15 minutes, and she's going to focus on some work that we put out a couple of weeks back, which looks at how vacancies have been recovering across the economy and looks to see the extent to which that's been occurring in a broad-based way, as opposed to being focused in certain places and in certain industries. At the end of all of that, we'll have time for questions. There is a Slido link that's available on the IFS website alongside this stream. So please do put your questions in there that you have for the presenters, and do vote for those questions you think are particularly interesting. So I'll be choosing from those at the end of the two presentations. But for now, I'm just going to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to present the Green Budget work. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Yes, so this is some joint work with my colleague Adam Salisbury, and thinking about what we know about employment and the labour market more generally at the end, as we come to the end of the furlough scheme. I'm sure many of you will have seen a graph like this at some point over the last 12 months or so. That shows the number of people that were that were furloughed since the start of the pandemic. And as we can see, its peak in the first lockdown, the furlough scheme was supporting the incomes of 8.9 million employment, and that has thankfully fallen down to now only 1.6 million people furloughed at the end of July 2021, which is the latest data that HMRC has provided. And of that 1.6 million, 900,000 of them are fully furloughed or were fully furloughed, and 700,000 were flexibly furloughed. And the other thing you can see from this graph is just that the fall in the number of people being furloughed has been larger than that expected by the Office for Budget Responsibility at their March forecast. And that's good news because really that seems to have come about from people going back to their jobs rather than kind of very widespread redundancies in the first part of this year. Of course, the last thing we should say about the furlough scheme is just that it has cost a very large amount of money. The latest data showing a total gross cost of almost £70 billion up to August. Well, what can we say about kind of the potential success of the furlough scheme? Well, one metric, and only one metric, is the unemployment rate, which is shown here back to 2007, up to the latest data in the second quarter of 2021. And the latest data shows the unemployment rate of 4.6%, which is it is up on its pre-pandemic levels, but it is nowhere near the kind of 8.5% unemployment rate that was seen in 2011 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And the forecasters who think about the macro side of the economy and what's going to happen to that are relatively optimistic that we're not going to see kind of widespread unemployment at the end of the furlough scheme. The average forecast of those compiled by HM Treasury for the end of this year is only 5.4%, so still nowhere near the very high levels of unemployment seen during the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And that in itself is a success of this scheme, protecting jobs and keeping that link between employers and employees. So as the furlough scheme ends, what are some key questions that I'm going to go through in this presentation? Well, the first is who's still on the furlough scheme as it comes to an end? Because although we don't know how many people are going to lose their jobs, it's more likely that people lose their jobs if they are on the furlough scheme in the summer than if they weren't. So who is likely to be affected by that? Secondly, there have been redundancies throughout the pandemic. How many of those people have found a new work, and has it been easier for some groups than others? Third, a question that has been high up the policy agenda for quite a long time now is how hard has it been for young adults, particularly those who just left education during the pandemic, to find work? And then I'm going to pass the last question off on labour market vacancies and opportunities onto my colleague, Zhao Wei. But I'll look at these first three questions in the rest of this presentation. So in terms of who is still on the furlough scheme, who looked at more risk of losing their job as it comes to an end, we've identified a number of different groups who look more likely to have been furloughed in July. And what I've shown here is these are the kind of some of the groups that we've identified that are more likely than average to have been furloughed. The first one is Londoners. In July, they were 41% more likely to be furloughed than employees on average. And really London kind of stands out compared to the rest of the country in that regard. Men are slightly more likely to have been furloughed than women. Older workers, particularly those above the age of 60, are more likely than average to have been furloughed, 30% more likely. Those with lower educational qualifications, particularly those without degrees, are about a quarter more likely than average to have been furloughed. And people who are the only worker in the household seem to be also more likely to have been furloughed. And that was particularly important. When we looked into this in detail, we think that about just over half of those furloughed in July were the only worker in their household. And that's particularly important because somebody, if they do lose their job, then they will probably end up in a workless household with no other person's income to fall back upon. Of course, they will be able to fall back upon the welfare safety net, but they're likely to be exposed to kind of big falls in their living standards compared to if they had a partner, for example, who might be able to support them more effectively. So that's these groups look at more risk. But as I said earlier, despite the furlough scheme, there still have been redundancies during the pandemic. And this is the redundancy rate per 1,000 employees going all the way back again to 2007, so we can see how it compared to the financial crisis. What you can see here is a couple of things. One is that there was a really big spike in redundancies in the summer and autumn of last year. That actually came about starting in August 2021 as the furlough scheme changed to mean that employers had to make at least a small contribution towards the cost of their furloughed workers. That's when the redundancy spiked, but that they have fallen right back down again. Now, in total, we think that there's been about 1 million redundancies over the 15 months from April 2020 to June 2021. That's just under double the rate seen pre-pandemic in the few years before the pandemic. In terms of who has been most affected by redundancies? Well, a particular group stands out here again, which is London. So that blue line is the same line that I just showed you, but I've now got a purple line which just looks at the redundancy rate for London. It's a bit more varied because of the smaller sample sizes in the labour market data, but you can see that that spike in redundancies is considerably higher for London than it was in the country as a whole. But one thing that's going to be very important for people is not only how many people are made redundant, but to what extent is it easy or hard for them to find new work. And so we use data that follows people through their economic lives from the Labour Force Survey to look at the re-employment rates of those people who've been made redundant during the pandemic, and also compare it to kind of some previous periods. So this is what I'm going to show you here. We've got three periods. First, from the global financial crisis. Secondly, from a kind of pre-COVID period between 2017 and 2019, and last, during the pandemic. So if you take people who were made redundant in the global financial crisis, within 3 months of redundancy, 30% of them had found a new job, and within 6 months, about half of them had found a new job. That's not particularly high rates. It was a big recession, the biggest recession at that point up since the 1920s. So if you compare to more normal times, the pre-COVID period, you can see that those re-employment rates at 3 and 6 months were considerably higher than they were during the financial crisis. Now, if I bring up the data for the pandemic in yellow, what you can see is that the re-employment rates are lower than they were for the period immediately pre-pandemic, but they actually look a little bit better than that seen during the global financial crisis and the recession that followed it. And in a sense, I think that's quite surprising because of how large the drop in national income was, and the reduced labour market opportunities during the recession, the pandemic recession. And so this does, while these are big falls in re-employment compared to the pre-pandemic, I think that they are not as bad as we might have expected to have seen. Again, this overall picture masks trends that differ for different types of people in different parts of the country. And again, I'm just going to pick out a couple of the key differences that we found. There are more differences shown in the chapter that you can look at for yourselves, but some of the key differences are this. So these are now just the 6-month re-employment rates for redundant workers. So it was just that right-hand bar on the last chart, and now I split it between the rest of between London on the right and the rest of the United Kingdom on the left. And really, what you can see here is that the re-employment rates of redundant workers in London are considerably lower than they were pre-pandemic, and have fallen a lot faster than in the rest of the country. They're 20 percentage points down after 6 months in London, implying that it has been a lot harder for Londoners to get back into work after losing their jobs. Now, to be fair, this data comes with a bit of a lag. You have to see people be made redundant and then wait for them to get jobs and report that. So this isn't kind of completely 100% up to date, but this does show the picture over the course of the pandemic as a whole and how hard it's been for Londoners. The other group that I think it's worth pointing out are older workers. So again, people who are over the age of 50, if they are made redundant, it doesn't always look like it is harder for them to get back into work, some of them. But the key thing here, the yellow bar on the right of this slide shows that only just over a third of redundant workers aged 50 or over have managed to find a new job within 6 months. And that's almost 15 percentage points down on the pre-pandemic re-employment rates. Again, this group looks like they are more hard hit than than the population average. And there is, I'm going to stay on an issue for older workers because there's an additional issue, which is in the United States in the Great Recession, it was seen that some people who lost their jobs when they were in their 50s or early 60s would unfortunately never go back to work, and they ended up retiring early. And that had bad impacts on their living standards then and throughout their retirement as they saved less. Now, we don't know whether that's happening in the UK, but I'm going to show you some signs which is a little bit concerning about that. This looks at the economic activity of those employees made redundant, again, 6 months after losing their jobs. And what I want you to look at here are these grey bars. These are people who are neither in work nor kind of actively searching for work, the unemployed that are put in the yellow bars there. You can see big chunks of redundant workers over the age of 60 are not searching for work. And that means that it's going to be harder for them to find fundamentally new jobs and get back into the labour market. And this is a trend that we haven't seen actually for younger workers kind of dropping out of the labour force. Those grey bars haven't been expanding for younger workers. This particular thing that we need to, difficulty therefore that we've identified for people over the age of 60. The last thing I'm going to bring up is about young people, and that was a third of my questions. And there's been a lot of talk about how difficult it's been for young adults, and the labour market data really justifies that. This here shows the employment rates in green 3 to 6 months after people left education, and shows the kind of the graduation year. So this is people who've left either school or university in 2020 or in 2019, 2018, etc. What you can see here are that 3 to 6 months after leaving education, that there were huge falls in the employment rates of these young adults as they really struggled to get jobs. The data for the 2020 cohort is around the autumn and Christmas of last year. But the good news is that as more data has come in for this cohort through into the spring of this year, we can then look at the employment rates 9 to 12 months after graduating. And you can see that once you add that in, there's been a catch up of young people, and their employment rates 9 to 12 months after graduating look a lot more similar to the cohorts that graduated pre-pandemic. So it's not that they haven't had a difficult period over the last year or so, but it does look like a considerably improving picture for them. Okay, what are my conclusions then? Well, it looks like the furlough scheme has been successful in preventing widespread rises in unemployment, although there are some forecast small rises as some people lose their jobs as the scheme ends. And the re-employment rates of people who have lost their jobs they are down on pre-pandemic, which isn't surprising, but they are fairly robust compared to those seen during the financial crisis. On the other hand, some notes of caution really seem to be around London, which does look to have been hit hard on multiple fronts, more likely to be furloughed, higher redundancies and lower re-employment rates. And there seem to be some particular challenges for older workers, many of whom seem to be leaving the labour force rather than actively searching for work after redundancy. So that's the end of my presentation, and my colleague Xiaowei is going to take over next with the next presentation.
Great, thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's all working. So I'm going to talk about some recent work looking at how job opportunities have evolved over the pandemic. So there's been a lot of focus on vacancies in recent months, a lot of headlines about acute labour shortages in things like driving and storage. And I think the media narrative on this has given the impression of us being in a buoyant labour market with lots of opportunities. And perhaps in that sort of a context, the end of the furlough scheme wouldn't be a big deal because people can just move on to new jobs. But of course, the media narrative has been focused on a small handful of occupations, and they've tended to focus on overall vacancy numbers, not the number of people competing for these jobs overall. So we wanted to take a closer look at the data and look at what's going on, not just in aggregate, but also for different types of people. And not to give too much away, but essentially we think that the shortages, whilst real, are not representative of the labour market as a whole. And actually for most people, competition for jobs is actually tougher, not lower than before the pandemic. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by talking about how vacancies have changed over the course of the pandemic, how that differs across occupations and also across regions. I'm going to introduce a measure of new job opportunities that captures the relevant vacancies for different types of people. And finally, I'm going to have a look at the other side of the equation as well, namely how many people are competing for these new vacancies and what that means for the levels of competition for jobs. Vacancies fell sharply at the start of the pandemic as we entered into the first lockdown. So by the end of April 2020, at the height of the pandemic, vacancies were more than 60% down on their April 2019 levels. This fall in vacancies was seen right across the economy. So aside from a handful of occupations, mainly in healthcare and social services, almost all occupations saw a massive collapse in vacancies at the start of the pandemic. Now, what this means is that although furloughing and layoffs were concentrated in those face-to-face service sectors that were shut down at the start of the pandemic, the disruption to people's careers at the start of the pandemic was much more widespread than that. So this fall in vacancies would have been important for new people entering the labour market or for people re-entering the labour market, as well as for people in work who would have otherwise moved between jobs over the course of their careers. And we know that job-to-job moves are an increasingly important way for people to progress in their careers and to increase their wages. But of course, just looking at the vacancies in any given occupation is only a crude proxy for the opportunities facing people in these occupations. And that's because typically people would move between occupations over the course of their careers. So what we do is we develop a new measure of opportunities that captures the vacancies in people's typical career trajectories over time. So just to fix the idea, imagine there's a cashier, and imagine in normal times, 90% of cashiers would go on to another cashier job, whereas 10% of cashiers would become store managers. Now, our measure of job opportunities would capture vacancies in both cashier roles and store manager roles, weighted by these probabilities of transition. So it's a bit more complicated than this, but like conceptually, you can think about it as a weighted average of vacancies in people's career trajectories. So when we take this measure of opportunities, we see that the impact at the start of the pandemic was even more widespread. And in particular, even in these occupations where vacancies held up at the start of the pandemic, people in these occupations would have seen a fall in opportunities. That's because nurses, for example, and people in social care would have normally moved on to occupations that were badly affected by the pandemic. Now, of course, we know that vacancies have now recovered since the height of the pandemic, and indeed in the latest data, aggregate vacancies were above their pre-pandemic level. I should note here that in this chart, we're using data from the ONS, which draws on Azuna vacancy data. Our micro data from Azuna runs out at the end of June. So the next couple of charts I'm going to show relate to June 2021, so they're slightly out of date. However, we can see here that aggregate vacancy levels haven't changed much since the end of June. So what we see here is that despite the fact that aggregate vacancies are now higher than pre-pandemic, this varies a lot across occupations, and actually a large share of people are in occupations that still have lower opportunities relative to pre-pandemic. So what we see here is that the surge in aggregate vacancies we've seen in recent months has in large part been driven by a handful of occupations, including transport drivers and storage occupations, which include warehousing, where vacancies more than doubled on their pre-pandemic levels. On the other hand, there's a long tail of occupations where vacancies and opportunities remain below pre-pandemic levels. And that includes a number of relatively high-skilled occupations in things like business, finance, healthcare, and the law. So indeed, if we look across the workforce as a whole and look at the fields of work people are in, we think a high share of workers are in occupations where opportunities are still lower than pre-pandemic. So we estimate that a quarter of the workforce still face lower opportunities in June 2021 relative to pre-pandemic. Now, as I alluded to in the previous chart, the surge in vacancies we've seen in recent months has really been driven by relatively low paid occupations like driving and transport. So here what we do is we split occupations based on their pre-pandemic wage levels and look at how vacancies have evolved in each of these categories. And we see that, for the first year or so of the pandemic, vacancies in low, medium, and high paid jobs evolved in a relatively similar way, but they start to diverge at the start of this year. And actually you see this big surge in low paid occupations, mainly driven by driving and storage occupations. So whilst vacancies in these low paid occupations were substantially above pre-pandemic levels in June 2021, vacancies in other occupations had just recovered to their pre-pandemic levels. Now, this pattern of low paid and sort of relatively low quality jobs recovering most quickly after recessions is something we see in previous recessions as well. So this is a well-established pattern in the literature. But I think this time around, it's also been compounded by a structural shift towards e-commerce and therefore more home deliveries, which have driven up demand for jobs in driving and storage. We also see that the growth in vacancies has varied across regions as well. And in particular, the recovery in London has lagged the rest of the country. So I think this sort of underpins a lot of the things Jonathan showed about re-employment rates being lower in London and furlough rates being lower in London. So our analysis of the data suggests that the slower recovery in London is happening within occupations as well. So it's not just driven by the composition of occupations in London versus the rest of the country. And I think perhaps this does reflect more of a structural shift as well as people move to working from home as a result of the pandemic. So far I've been talking about what's happened to vacancies, but of course that's only half the equation for how difficult it is to find a job. The other half being how many other people are competing for these vacancies. And as Jonathan showed, the disruption caused by the pandemic has led to an increase in unemployment over the pandemic. So here what we do is we look at the number of unemployed people per new job opportunity across different occupations as a measure of competition for new jobs. And what we see is that in June 2021, actually a majority of unemployed people worked in fields where competition for new jobs was still higher than pre-pandemic. Now, in this chart, I'm only including unemployed people in our measure of competition. But of course, I think there's also reason to believe that on-the-job search is now higher than pre-pandemic. So people also face more competition from people in work. And if some people who are furloughed at the moment are laid off at the end of the furlough scheme, then competition would be stiffer still. So just to illustrate, if we include furloughed workers in June 2021 in our measure of job seekers, then almost all job seekers would face substantially higher competition than before the pandemic. The last thing I want to stress is that the groups that were most badly affected at the start of the pandemic were no longer the groups that were most badly affected in June 2021. So this chart here shows that in April 2020, so at the start of the pandemic, competition for jobs had increased most for young people and for those with low levels of education. So this reflects the fact that the young and the low educated were most likely to work in those low paid service sectors that were shut down at the start of the pandemic, and therefore those that saw the largest drop in vacancies and the largest layoff rates. However, by June 2021, the groups that saw the highest level of competition relative to pre-pandemic were no longer the young and lowest educated, and actually you see much higher or much larger increase in competition among those with degrees. It's no longer the case that the young are doing worse than older age groups by this measure. So you'll note that this is plotted on a different scale because, of course, overall levels of competition were much lower than at the start of the pandemic. But what I want you to draw attention to focus on is the relative magnitude across these groups. So I think this chimes with some things Jonathan's been saying, as well in relation to how younger and older workers have been doing. And I think it's important because many of the government schemes that have been introduced have focused on younger workers and on those who are low paid. So to sum up, we have seen aggregate vacancies recover to above pre-pandemic levels. However, this recovery in aggregate vacancies masks huge variation across occupations. And indeed, the surge we've seen in recent months has really been driven by a small set of relatively low paid occupations, with higher paid occupations being slower to recover. Vacancy growth has also been slower in London than the rest of the country. Secondly, the fact that unemployment has increased over the course of the pandemic means that competition for new jobs is still higher than pre-pandemic for most groups, and would be even more so the case if people are laid off at the end of the furlough scheme. And the groups that were most badly affected at the start of the pandemic no longer seem to be the groups that are most badly affected now. Great, so I think with that, I'll hand over back to Carl.
Thank you very much, Xiaowei. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Lots of fantastic detail in there, digging into the data, telling us about the patterns across different groups, across different parts of the country, across different industries. As I said at the start, do put your questions into Slido. That's where I'll be choosing questions from, and do vote for your favorite questions. The link is available alongside where you're streaming this video from. So I'll start with the question which has risen to the top of the list. You both highlighted a particular concern about the situation in the labour market in London at the moment, in terms of redundancies, in terms of the numbers on furlough, in terms of the chances of people who've been made redundant moving back to work, and also in terms of what's happened to the vacancy rate there. So the question is this really specific to London, or is this what's happening in big cities across the whole of the UK more widely? And the kind of follow-up part is that just because the big cities, you're not seeing returns to office working in the centre of cities yet, and therefore we might, if we're optimistic, we might think that that recovery is still to come, and it will come once office workers are back in their desks and they're spending money in cafes and restaurants, etc., in their local working environment. So I'll hand over to you both for a stab at that one.
So I can take a start. So we did actually look at this in the vacancies work. That bit is still work in progress, so it's not in the report we put out, but we're certainly looking more into it for future work. So what we see so far is actually London does stand out even among big cities. So even compared to other big cities, the recovery in London seems slower. So, and actually there's not a huge difference overall between big cities and other towns. So it does seem to be London specific, and I think that's quite curious. We're not sure why that's the case. I wonder if part of it has to, and I haven't looked at the data on this, but I wonder if the shift towards working from home has been different in London versus other cities, because people in London tend to commute much longer distances. Maybe people have shifted to working from home more as a result of the pandemic than in other cities, and they're slower to recover to city centres. I also wonder how much tourism has to do with it. So the fact that London used to get a great deal of international tourism.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what Xiaowei said, except the additional thing is just London is so much bigger than our next biggest cities. And so, we talk about big cities of Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, that they are big compared to most places, but they, do pale into, they're much, much smaller than London. And so it's very hard to get any comparison compared to London in that sense.
Okay, so maybe the more natural comparison would be for somebody probably not the IFS to be comparing what's happening in big capital cities around the world and whether there's a phenomena of those cities struggling relative to their national economies. That would be pretty interesting to see, I think. So there's a question about looking for an economic forecast, not usually the type of thing we do here, but I mean, clearly the work we've presented here does tell us a story about what might happen to unemployment and what might happen to unemployment amongst different groups. Perhaps you can both touch on perhaps where you see the risks being biggest or where you might be more optimistic.
Do you want to start on this one, Jonathan?
Yeah, so okay, I don't know what number unemployment is going to be. Lots of smart people do work trying to work that out. But I think it would be sensible to suggest that it's going to be more difficult in terms of number of people losing their jobs and in terms of unemployment of any sector that still has restrictions that affect it. And we are loosening, restrictions have been are being loosened in the travel industry, but that does stand out as one that's had a longer period of restrictions, and there still are some on international travel. So I think that kind of jumped out to me as a sector where that for public health reasons, there's almost a reason to kind of be slightly pessimistic about the employment prospects there.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I also don't have a number to offer, but I think there's at least two things that could point to a rather more optimistic picture on unemployment. So reasons you might believe there won't be a big spike on unemployment when the furlough scheme ends. One is that this time round, employers have been paying towards their furloughed staff for quite a long time now, right? So employers already have to pay pension contributions, they have to pay national insurance contributions. So unlike the very start of the furlough scheme, it's no longer free for employers to keep staff on furlough. So what we see in terms of redundancies at the initial phases of the pandemic was that redundancy numbers spiked when employers started having to make contributions. And this time around, they've been making contributions this whole time, so perhaps you wouldn't expect them to be keeping people on furlough unless they thought they would realistically rehire them. I guess another cause for optimism is that so if employers want to make large-scale redundancies, they need to notify that in advance. And we haven't seen a spike in notifications in the lead up to the end of the furlough scheme. So at least it doesn't seem like these large-scale redundancies are being planned.
Thank you. And actually, I mean, that in part addresses the next question, which was explicitly on kind of essentially, I guess, guessing at the idea that surely we're not going to see lots of furloughed workers losing their jobs now because employers have been paying costs towards their employment in recent months. And I don't know if there's anything else that might be going on there, perhaps Jonathan, or any other concerns about what might employers be doing, or whether actually no, even though they've been paying in, there still is a risk of losing your job in the next few weeks.
I think there's probably more of a risk than the average employee, but the question, why would they be paying them to keep furloughed if they're not going to bring them back? I think there could be some employers that have kind of fairness considerations that want to keep their employees supported for as long as possible, if it's possible for them to do that. These kind of almost paternalistic attitudes to some of their employees. But then, they come to the end of furlough scheme and they don't have a role for them. That could be one reason. The other reason could just be if there's a lot of, if they do value their employees, but there's a vast amount of uncertainty, they might just be kind of delaying the decision until the last possible moment, which is essentially today. So I think that's another reason.
Yeah. Okay. So scrolling down the questions a little bit, because we focused quite a lot on London. I mean, another big finding was what this means for older people, people close to the state pension age who've lost their jobs. I guess one question I had was whether actually in recessions, is it quite common for people who are closer to the retirement age who've left work to become inactive at that point? There's a couple of questions in Slack, one about whether in Slido, one of which is about whether we know anything about whether it's kind of high income, high wealth households doing it, which I guess might say, well, they're choosing to retire in a sense, or to what extent is it lower income households where perhaps it might be reflecting more of a constraint. They can't find suitable work at the moment. And a kind of related question, which is, are there some positive reasons there? Could it be that some older workers have reevaluated their priorities and decided that not returning to work is just better for them?
So, I think the big thing here is that the kind of key thing that I identified is people not searching for work, but and not finding work and not being in work after they've lost their job. Now, the key there is what we don't see is a vast increase in the number of people saying that they were retired. You might expect if people were more comfortable, they've received a shock. Oh, I'm going to retire a year anyway. It doesn't make much difference to my economic circumstances. I'll call myself retired. And that, I think if people were retiring quite quickly, I don't think that would be necessarily the worst. It might imply, that people weren't facing too much of a shock to their living standards, for example. I think it's slightly more worrying that it's just people not saying they're retired, but they're also not searching for work. Are they discouraged? Or some of it could be a temporary thing about having me worried about the pandemic. Clearly, COVID is a lot worse for older people. So it's not totally, I don't think it's totally nailed down quite what's going on, but I don't think that we can just dismiss this. I wouldn't say Carl was dismissing it, but I don't think one could dismiss it as a kind of, oh, they'll be all right. They've got lots of wealth and they, and they'll just have a nice retirement. I think there's reason to be a bit more concerned than that.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I was going to stress the point that maybe part of it is temporary because older people might be more reluctant to return to work, especially given I think the LFS data is now slightly old. So maybe the rate of vaccinations has also increased since then in the general population, and maybe older people would be happier to go back to work than, when the data was collected.
Okay. So slightly different age group. There's a question from Ruth George here on parents and, of course, their working patterns and how that's affected them, particularly if they're at home working and had to manage children during lockdowns. I know some earlier work from IFS looked at this. I don't know if Xiaowei or Jonathan, you want to add any aspect on that?
I know of the earlier work, but I feel like there's been more work since then that I haven't kept on top of. But certainly the earlier work showed that. So it was really quite striking because women weren't more likely to be furloughed than men at the start of the pandemic, but mothers were much more likely to have been furloughed than fathers. So it really seems to have been a childcare effect of mothers being the primary childcare providers when schools were closed down. And of course, there's lots and lots of research on the effect of career interruptions, the effect of having children on women's career progression later on. So that initial period, even though schools then reopened, it's possible that that initial period will have longer term effects on mothers' career trajectories, especially relative to fathers who carried on working. I think that this is just pure speculation now, but I think the fact that people are shifting to working from home is essentially interesting, because there's work to suggest that one of the reasons for the gender pay gap is that when they have children, women start limiting their job search to a small radius of their home. So they know that they're going to be the ones who have to pick up their kids from nursery. So they start looking for jobs close by, and that hugely limits their choice of jobs, their choice of firms, and also limits their bargaining power with respect to their employers, right? So I wonder if one positive effect of the pandemic is that as people shift to working from home, that constraint will be less relevant for women.
Thank you. So returning a bit to the London point, there's a question about geographical mobility, and whether people are moving their region, for example, to find employment. I kind of had a related thought when Jiawei was saying, well, people in one occupation might switch, one industry might switch to a different industry. I kind of had a thought, well, actually, maybe when you recover from a recession, do you see more people switching industry? And I guess related to the question on Slido here, do we see more people starting to move region now than what would have happened perhaps pre-pandemic?
I mean, I don't know that we have kind of enough data yet on people switching regions. There is not a vast, for most people in the country, there is, most people don't switch regions, maybe once in their lives or twice, but, it's not a common thing. You do get young adults after leaving education moving in particular to London, and you do get a kind of a set of people leaving London, particularly around having children. But again, those are kind of driven by bigger, often life events or early career choices, rather than kind of to the kind of vagaries of what jobs are available right now. I'd be surprised if you see big changes there.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a really interesting question. But I mean, so far the data suggests that people in the UK are not very mobile, with the exception of graduates at the start of their careers. Like, people generally don't move very much. And if you look at people's stated reasons for moving, people generally do not move for employment, again, with the exception of graduates at the start of their careers. So I would be quite surprised if this led to a massive reallocation.
So I think this is the question at the top of the pile is, I think, for Jiawei, which is specifically about lorry drivers. But I guess more broadly, we've spoken about sort of lack of vacancies and tightness in the labour market. I wonder if there's a bit more you could expand on where actually the opportunities are perhaps highest, and for whom it might be a relatively good story coming out of your presentation rather than a bad one.
Yeah, I mean, so I had that chart on vacancies at the end of June relative to pre-pandemic, and they're the ones that really stood out were driving and storage, which includes warehousing, like those occupations where vacancies were more than double pre-pandemic levels, right? So it's definitely a good news story for some areas, but as I said, they tend to be relatively low paid compared to lots of other occupations. And of course, it's possible that competition, like the tightness in those labor markets, will drive up wages a bit, but I think they will remain not the highest paid jobs in the economy.
Okay, so those data were from June, so I'll be very interested to see what's happened over more recently.
I would also be very interested. We're getting another batch of data, of micro data from Mizuno this month, actually, that would cover data up to September. The thing with the ONS data is that they can't look at specific occupations, which is something we've done internally. So I think they look at things by industry, but there's a very broad classification, so you miss out on these very dramatic changes in certain occupations.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions about a question about the cost of furlough. So Jonathan mentioned almost £70 billion worth of cost, and a bit of a concern that, well, we've benefited from lower unemployment so far, but what happens when we have to repay that cost? And then there's another question, which I think is kind of similar, which is the global financial crisis. The recession there was bad, but in some ways, what was even more striking was the real slowness and appallingness of the economic recovery that happened over subsequent years. Are there reasons to be concerned about the furlough scheme having hangover effects or other things you're seeing in the labour market data that might make you worried about employment prospects over the next few years, even once perhaps the virus has started to hopefully pass away?
So there's a couple of things here. One problem with the furlough scheme is that it froze the labour market, and to the extent that there were some opportunities rising, we all think about supermarket delivery vans, for example, or things like that. And some shrinking, and it was harder with the furlough scheme for labour to kind of reallocate towards kind of growing areas, and if you don't have that reallocation in the long run, it's going to weigh down on productivity growth, for example, if you have a misallocation of labour. I don't know if we don't really know. While that clearly was be important of a short period where the furlough scheme's in, we don't really know yet whether that's going to be important in the longer term. In terms of the labour market in the longer term, there's going to be two things going on here. One is lots of people have lost out of some experience from being in work, even if they haven't lost their jobs. A lot of people haven't been at their desks or at their personal coal faces doing their jobs. And so they won't have, gained from the knowledge and skills from that work. So that might have a small hangover effect. On the other hand, not many people have actually lost their jobs entirely, and the kind of difficulties that people find, of unemployment itself being a very discouraging state, for example. So on average, I think that means that I don't think we have any evidence that the furlough scheme itself is causing any longer term problems, and on terms, except for that it has prevented a loss of unemployment, and so that would be a good sign, really.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think I definitely agree that the standard scarring arguments with recessions do still apply, and I think part of the thing with unemployment is like, what is it about unemployment that has a future scarring effect, right? Is it the stigma of being unemployed, or is it just having lost out on that period of experience and building up skills while you're unemployed? Because if that's the case, if that's the driver of scarring effects, then everyone who's been furloughed for all these months will have the same sort of scarring effects going forward, even though they haven't been made unemployed. I think a sign for optimism is just, this isn't a recession caused by like massive structural issues in the economy, right? This is very much a self-imposed recession where we simply close down entire sectors of the economy for long periods of time. So I don't see a reason for like a massive slowdown in productivity and wages that we saw after the 2008 recession.
Thank you. So the question now at the top of the pile relates a little bit to this, which is somebody's noted that, well, hospitality's got a lot of people on furlough, and it's also an industry where there are a lot of vacancies. So the question is really, why is it that people who are being furloughed aren't taking those jobs that are there? And I think there's a question further down in Slido about to what extent are people who are furloughed in one job getting another job? Do we have any evidence of that?
I don't know about people being furloughed and taking another job. I guess why would people who are furloughed not take a new job? Well, if you're offered 80% of your pre-tax pay, which is for a lot of people probably closer to 90% of their post-tax pay, then maybe that kind of order of magnitude, then would you go out to work if you could not work? So my point is that some people will take that kind of a view and therefore won't. I'm not saying everybody. Some people take that view, and that's the right balance for them, and therefore they won't look for another job. So in a sense, that high vacancy rate and the higher furlough rate, maybe that is one of those points where that furlough scheme does prevent this movement from kind of firms that are open to firms that are closed to firms that are open, or firms that are seeing more demand, less demand to more demand, and the furlough scheme doesn't allow that. Now, clearly, from tomorrow, that will be possible, and so we will see over time whether this is something, whether that's something that lessens vacancies in these industries.
Yeah, I think there might be an element of geographical mismatch as well. So maybe there's lots of cafe workers who are furloughed in London, lots of vacancies, I don't know, somewhere outside London. And maybe that's creating a barrier to these people finding jobs. I do agree with Jonathan that the furlough has probably frozen the labour market and sort of delayed the sort of reallocation. And one piece of evidence there is that we know the rate of business closures has dropped over the pandemic, which I think suggests that the furlough scheme is keeping certain businesses afloat that would have otherwise shut down.
Thank you. So one final question, which is from Kevin Langford. And I'll elaborate on it a little bit. So we know that recessions come along approximately once a decade. This furlough scheme has been incredibly successful in terms of keeping unemployment down. Does that mean that come the next recession, we should reach again for a furlough scheme? And are there things we can do to prepare to make sure we've got perhaps an even better furlough scheme in place next time?
Maybe I'll start, and Joey can improve upon my answer.
Go for it.
I think assuming that the next recession is not due to a pandemic, I don't think I would be going to Treasury and recommending that they just reinstate the furlough scheme. One of the reasons for having a furlough scheme at the very beginning was the fact that government was telling people that they could not go to work, and maybe the responsibility of government to support people there where they are preventing them from working is different to one where just kind of overall there is a contraction of output. Secondly, we also didn't particularly mind if people didn't work during that first period. It actually had a benefit to society of reducing transmission of the virus. We were, policymakers weren't really worried about any work incentives at that point. So I think there's a number, and this does come with enormous cost and capacity for, to be frank, it does have a capacity for fraud or things like that. So resurrecting the furlough scheme, probably not. There may well be more case for during recessions there to be more earnings replacement support for people who lose their jobs, as is done in other countries which have more unemployment insurance schemes. So I think there's a case for having something more like that, albeit at higher cost to the exchequer probably. But I think that would probably be preferable to a full furlough scheme.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think the furlough scheme was, designed in very, very unusual times, where, with the pandemic, the point was to freeze the economy, right? And I think the bet was that the economy would basically reemerge after the pandemic, the way it was before the pandemic. And now, even we're seeing now that that's not the case. There are some structural shifts towards e-commerce, towards home working as a result of the pandemic. And we certainly wouldn't expect the economy to be frozen during a normal recession. I absolutely agree with Jonathan that it might open the door to more employment insurance programs. And I think it's really important to stress that the welfare system in the UK is so unusual compared to other countries in Europe for not having this sort of unemployment insurance scheme where you're the benefits you receive having been made unemployed are tied to your previous earnings. And I think, so like the welfare scheme at the moment, I think is very much focused on preventing poverty and very much focused on sort of almost like targeting a set group of people who all like who remain on welfare for a long time, rather than letting people adjust to shocks. And we saw at the start of the pandemic, you know, if we didn't have the furlough scheme, then what would happen to people who lost their jobs and weren't able to move to a lower value property, weren't able to adjust their household spending? I think it would have been extremely, extremely difficult. So perhaps, you know, this whole experience has at least highlighted this quirk in our welfare system, and maybe made people think more about these trade-offs.
Right, thank you very much both, and thanks for the whole event, which I've enjoyed enormously. We're now at the end of the hour, so thank you very much everyone who's been watching. Please look out for more events, more publications on our website. As I said earlier, our main Green Budget launch is happening on the 12th of October, and hopefully many of you will be tuning in then. Okay.